Okay, so the passage today is Genesis 45, verses 1 through 12. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here. Because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, 'This is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me, you, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds and all you have. I will provide for you there because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it is really I who am speaking to you.'" Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the character of Joseph. He's a pretty popular guy in the Old Testament. He had some dreams that got him into some trouble. His life seems to pan out like a series of unfortunate events. There have been movies, plays, musicals, all written about Joseph, and what do they typically center around? His ability to interpret dreams. But is that all that there is to Joseph? Was he merely a dream interpreter for God? From reading this passage, it would seem like Joseph has a bit more depth of character than that. And in my opinion, I feel like he's actually one of the most articulate theologians in the book of Genesis. So in order to understand Joseph's claims about God, I'm going to build up to this moment in his story. Context is definitely key in this moment. Once we get a broader understanding of Joseph, it will be easier to understand this passage, and we'll be able to go into more depth in these verses. Then I will offer you some answers to why this story should matter to us and what the point is, because while you might think that the main point of this passage is forgiveness, it is actually that God can use what humans intend for evil to bring about good. Joseph must have been rather important to the Israelites to warrant 13 of the 50 chapters of Genesis to be about him. That's about a quarter of the book. Clearly the author of Genesis wants us to learn something from Joseph. So to start out in his life, he may have been a bit cocky with his ability to interpret dreams. Certainly his brothers thought so, though they take a rather extreme approach to solving the problem of an annoying sibling. It is easy to get jealous when parents play favorites, but selling your brother into slavery is extreme. This is where Joseph's life takes a bit of a bad turn. While his dad thinks he's dead, he's actually in Egypt serving Potiphar. And he does fairly well in his duties. Potiphar likes him. Unfortunately for him, Potiphar's wife likes him a bit too much. And so in a he said, she said moment, Joseph gets thrown in jail. And it would seem that this would be the end of the story and that he would rot in prison for the rest of his life. But God did not forget Joseph. A couple of Pharaoh's officials, the head cupbearer and baker, get thrown into the same prison as Joseph. And Joseph uses his ability to interpret dreams when the cupbearer and baker have some pretty unusual ones. They start chatting, and Joseph reveals that the cupbearer has some good fortune coming his way, but the baker not so much. Life pans out just as Joseph said it would, and the cupbearer is restored to his position, but the baker is killed. But the cupbearer forgets Joseph, until Pharaoh starts having dreams. And the cupbearer remembers Joseph, and Joseph is able to use his dream abilities once more. and this time the fate of Egypt is in the balance. Joseph tells Pharaoh there will be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine, and Pharaoh thinks that Joseph's a pretty reasonable guy, so he puts him in charge. Now Joseph's life is taking a turn for the better. Ruler of all Egypt, Joseph plans for the famine, and once it hits, his family back in Canaan runs out of food, so they head down to Egypt. And that's when Joseph sees them. And needless to say, seeing his brothers was not a hallmark moment. A lot of bitterness boils up. And he sends his brothers on a bit of a wild goose chase to prove their identities. He keeps his brother Simeon captive and forces his brothers to bring the youngest brother Benjamin back to Egypt. Upon arrival back in Egypt, Joseph welcomes them and gives them plenty of food, but with a catch. He hides a silver goblet in Benjamin's sack, and the penalty is slavery. But in a moving speech by Judah, he pleads for Benjamin's life because he doesn't want to see the same thing happen to his father that happened when Joseph had disappeared. And this is where our passage picks up. So the context is definitely important here, and now we can understand this specific moment in the story more clearly. Imagine being Joseph's brothers, standing in that moment before the ruler of all of Egypt, terrified. They were terrified rightly so because their brother that they had wronged so horribly now had the power to kill all of them. But what did Joseph do? He forgives them. And not only that, he praises God for what they did to him. Joseph's not only a man who interprets dreams. He's a man who employs radical forgiveness. Joseph was able to come to a place where he could look back on the wrongs done to him, and he came to a shocking conclusion. It was God who sent him ahead to Egypt, not his brothers. He knew that God was in control of his life despite the suffering that he experienced. While forgiveness may not be the main point of this passage, it is important to point out that Joseph had already saved Egypt. He had already been used by God. He didn't need to do anything else to prove himself. And yet he still chose to forgive. God didn't force him to forgive, but he chose to forgive his brothers of his own volition. It was because of his forgiveness that Joseph saved his family too, not just Egypt. This whole speech by Joseph is also incredible because he's dropping his mask and revealing himself to his brothers. And God, using Joseph, is dropping his mask and revealing his workings to mankind. There's a dual revelation here. God is revealing that he cares not only for Israel, but for the rest of the world too. So now that we've looked more deeply at this passage, we can start to apply it to the present day, to our lives. Some of you might still be thinking, so what? Why does this matter? Why do we care about Old Testament characters? But like I said earlier, the main point of this passage is that God can use what humans intend for evil to bring about good. And that is apparent in Joseph's life. Many of us face dark moments in our lives at the hands of other people, and it would seem like that can have no good outcome. But we can see from the life of Joseph and from his very mouth that God is bigger than our circumstances. You may be facing a dark time even now, but I want to encourage you to keep trusting in God's plan. It's not easy. There will be times when you want to give up on God. You will have days where you are betrayed, cast down, and deeply wounded even by the people that you love most. But do not for a second think that God is not there with you, or that he can't use that circumstance for good. Stay strong in your hope for a better circumstance, in a better situation. And just as Joseph forgave his brothers in the height of his being used by God, there may be years between a wrongdoing and the moment to come to terms with it. The opportunity to forgive may come in the peak of ministry, or it may come in the trenches of ministry, but it will come. It is hard to live a life holding a grudge. A grudge may even hold you back from stepping into the next phase of ministry. And the next phase of ministry, it may be God's plan for your life. So while God can turn a situation around, he also asks us to be engaged in that process. How many times have you forgiven someone, especially when they did not deserve it? I know that for me this is not easy. But I hope that you see that as we've gone through the life of Joseph and realized his context and illuminated this specific story, that it's brought some important truths to light. and that you can start to apply these to your lives. Through all this, it is revealed that God can use what humans intend for evil to bring about good. And I would challenge you all to be radical forgivers, me included, because it may just be that the next step in God's plan involves your decision.